All right, today we're going to jump into a really interesting battle. One that, maybe isn't as famous as some of the big ones, but it has some really fascinating stuff going on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the sources you've given me here really show how, seemingly smaller engagements can still have a pretty huge impact on the bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when we talk about the Battle of Harlem Heights, it's September 16th, 1776, right in the thick of the Revolutionary War. And we really need to, I think, position this in the context of what's been going on in those weeks and months leading up to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, this is right in the middle of the New York and New Jersey campaign, a really critical time.
Absolutely. And so just to sort of set the stage, we're talking just a few weeks after the Battle of Long Island, late August. The Americans had suffered a pretty serious defeat there at the hands of the British under General Howe.
Right. And that forced Washington to evacuate his troops from Long Island across the East River to Manhattan.
Right. And, just picturing that nighttime evacuation, it must have been incredibly demoralizing for the troops. I mean, talk about a tough spot to be in.
Oh, for sure. I mean, they're already on the back foot, and the British aren't letting up. They follow up that victory with a landing at Kip's Bay on September 15th, just the day before Harlem Heights.
And that's where the sources you shared really paint a stark picture, almost a sense of panic among some of the American troops there. They start breaking and running almost as soon as the British land.
Yeah, and this, despite Washington's best efforts to rally them, to get them to hold the line, I mean, it really just goes to show how fragile the situation was for the Continental Army at that moment.
Yeah, they're really teetering on the brink of a complete collapse. And it's really only by nightfall on that 15th that Washington manages to pull together his entire force. We're talking about 9,000 men under his command, along with Generals Greene and Putnam.
And they retreat to the high ground in northern Manhattan, this area that becomes known as Harlem Heights, which really offers them a much-needed natural defensive position.
Right. So by this point, we've got a battered and bruised Continental Army huddled on this high ground, and facing them, a pretty determined British vanguard of about 5,000 men led by Henry Clinton.
Yeah, you've got all the ingredients for a pretty explosive encounter.
So let's get into that. So the next morning, September 16th, Washington receives intelligence reports of a possible British advance.
Right, but as it turns out, those reports were actually unfounded.
Right, a bit of a false alarm. But it's interesting because Washington, perhaps anticipating some sort of British movement, had already dispatched a reconnaissance mission under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton.
Knowlton, yeah, and his Rangers, a group of about 150 men, their job was to scout out the British lines, to gather intelligence on their positions and movements.
So essentially, they're the eyes and ears of the American army at this point.
Exactly, and it's not long before Knowlton's Rangers are spotted by British pickets from Brigadier General Alexander Leslie's Light Infantry Brigade.
And things escalate pretty quickly from there, right? I mean, it's not just a, oh, we see you, you see us kind of situation.
No, not at all. I mean, we're talking 2 or 3 companies from the 2nd Light Infantry Battalion launch an attack on Knowlton's Rangers.
Talk about an intense start to the day.
Right, and this leads to a running fight, a skirmish that unfolds through the woods and fields of the area, Jones and Hoagland's farms, places that probably don't mean much to us now, but back then, that was the battleground.
Yeah, and I mean, Knowlton, he's got a smaller force. He's facing the threat of being outflanked, so he makes the decision to pull his men back.
And the sources you shared really emphasize that this retreat was conducted in good order. I mean, no indication of a chaotic rout.
Yeah, and while there were about 10 American casualties during that initial exchange, it seems the withdrawal itself was done without confusion or loss, which really speaks to the discipline of those soldiers, even under pressure.
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to remember that even a retreat can be a skillful maneuver when executed properly.
Absolutely. So now Knowlton and his men are falling back towards the main American lines, and the British are in hot pursuit. Which brings us to a crucial location in this battle, the Holloway.
Right. The Holloway, essentially, it was a re-entrant in the landscape like a dip or a shallow valley, and it lay right in front of the American lines. Knowlton's Rangers retreat back into the American positions that were positioned at the edge of the woods, overlooking this Holloway.
So they're using the terrain to their advantage, trying to create a more defensible position.
Exactly. And the British, having pushed Knowlton back, they pause at the edge of those woods to regroup. And here's where a seemingly small detail really sheds light on the psychological aspect of warfare that we sometimes forget about. The British bugles start to sound.
Yes, the bugle calls. I remember reading in the sources how those bugles really stuck with Colonel Joseph Reed, who was Washington's adjutant general.
Right, Reed, he hears those bugles, and To him, they sound like, well, a fox hunt.
And he takes that as a deliberate insult, almost like the British are mocking them, taunting them as they retreat.
It's incredible how a sound like that can be interpreted and can actually fuel a desire to push back even harder.
Yeah, and it seems like that sentiment, that feeling of being mocked, it starts to resonate among some of the American troops, this sense of we need to prove ourselves.
And around the same time, the British receive reinforcements, elements of the 2nd and 3rd Light Infantry battalions, along with the 42nd Highlanders. They're all ordered forward, so the British are increasing their strength in the area.
So they're feeling confident, they've pushed the Americans back, they've got reinforcements coming in, it's setting up for, well, what happens next?
Yeah, and Washington, he's observing all of this, he sees an opportunity, and, it's important to remember that at this point, his primary objective isn't necessarily about gaining ground or inflicting massive casualties. It's really about boosting morale, restoring some confidence to his battered army.
And to do that, he comes up with a rather clever plan, a plan that involves a feint, a diversionary attack.
About 150 American volunteers, they're sent down into that holloway. The idea is to draw the British in, fix their attention there, while another force maneuvers around to flank them.
So it's a bit of a gamble, but one that Washington clearly feels is worth taking, given the circumstances.
Right. And this initial force, they engage the British troops who are positioned along a wooded fence line within the holloway.
And that initial skirmish, it actually draws in even more American troops, another 900 or so men. So now you've got this pretty sustained firefight going on down in the holloway.
And the sources you shared mention that because of the distance between the two sides, there aren't a ton of casualties on either side during this phase. But the real point is to pin the British down, to keep their attention focused there.
Right, because while that's happening, Washington has put into motion the second part of his plan, the flanking maneuver.
Exactly. And this is where Knowlton's Rangers come back into play. They're reinforced with 3 companies of Virginia riflemen under Major Andrew Leitch, bringing their total strength to around 200 men.
And their objective is to swing around and hit the British on their right flank, ideally catching them completely off guard.
It's a classic pincer movement. Try to hit them from 2 sides at once.
But as we know, battlefield plans rarely go perfectly according to script, and in this case, there's mention of a misdirection.
Right, some confusion. An unidentified officer, maybe in the heat of the moment, leads the flanking party to strike the British flank, not their rear as originally intended.
So not the perfect envelopment, but still hitting them from the side is going to cause some chaos and disruption.
Right, and it definitely puts pressure on the British. But tragically, both Colonel Knowlton and Major Leitch, the leaders of this flanking attack, are mortally wounded during the assault.
What a blow to lose both of those leaders in the midst of the attack. But, it's a testament to the courage and determination of those American troops that they keep pressing the attack even after losing their commanders.
And Washington, seeing how the battle is unfolding, seeing his men gaining ground, he decides to reinforce his troops in the holloway and launch a full-scale attack on the British positions.
So now we're really talking about a major engagement.
The British light infantry, facing pressure from the front and the flank, they start to give ground. They retreat across this open farmland towards a buckwheat field.
A buckwheat field. Yeah, it's fascinating. That area, according to the sources you shared, is now the location of Barnard College in Upper Manhattan.
What a connection, from a Revolutionary War battlefield to a modern-day college campus.
Yeah, it really brings history to life. And it's in this buckwheat field that the British receive reinforcements, including 2 crucial 3-pounder cannons.
Those cannons would have given them a much-needed firepower advantage.
And Washington, he's initially hesitant to pursue the British across that open ground. It's risky, but seeing his men holding their own, he changes his mind, sends in more reinforcements, and authorizes a full-on assault.
And this is where the battle really reaches its peak. I mean, by the time all the American reinforcements arrive, you've got nearly 1,800 men engaged in the fighting in and around that buckwheat field.
And even key members of Washington's staff, like Nathaniel Greene, arrived to direct the battle.
Yeah, the stakes are getting pretty high.
And the British are also reinforced. Their strength in the field is slightly less than the attacking American force, so we're talking about a pretty evenly matched fight at this point.
And it rages for a good hour and a half back and forth, fighting in the field, fighting in the woods. I mean, it must have been chaotic and intense.
But gradually, the tide starts to turn. The British, some of their units, including the artillery, they start running low on ammunition.
Right, and facing this relentless American attack and with dwindling supplies, the British begin to withdraw from the buckwheat field.
Which prompts an American pursuit. they're energized, they're sensing victory.
But Washington, ever the strategist, he's mindful of the bigger picture. He doesn't want to overextend his lines. He's also concerned about the possibility of additional British reinforcements arriving.
So he makes the call to halt the pursuit and order his troops back to their lines.
And it's really interesting how the American soldiers react to this order. According to your sources, they let out a huge cheer, a huzzah, and then
Wow,
withdraw from the field in good order. No sense of panic or defeat.
yeah, that really highlights the shift in morale that's taken place. They've gone toe-to-toe with the British and come out feeling like they've accomplished something significant.
And they have, but it did come at a cost.
Yeah.
We have to look at the casualties on both sides, and as you pointed out, the sources you share give us a few different numbers.
Right, and that's something we always have to be cautious about with historical accounts. Casualty figures are often disputed or incomplete.
Exactly, so we have to look at the different sources carefully. General Howe, in his official report to the British command, claimed 14 killed and 78 wounded. But interestingly, a member of his own staff recorded a higher number of wounded, and some historians like David McCullough suggest even heavier British losses, although without citing a specific source for those higher numbers.
Right, so there's some ambiguity there, but the most detailed analysis you shared comes from Henry Johnston, who wrote about this battle in 1817, and he puts the British losses at 14 killed and 157 wounded, and American losses at around 30 killed and 100 wounded.
And of course, those figures include the loss of both Colonel Knowlton and Major Litch, who died from their wounds a few days after the battle.
Two huge losses for the American army, but despite those losses, the psychological impact of the battle seems to have been overwhelmingly positive for the Americans.
Yeah, I mean, both sides claimed victory in their initial reports, but it's clear that the Americans came away from this feeling like they'd proven something to themselves and to the British.
And Washington himself, he observed that this pretty sharp skirmish, as he called it, had a hugely positive impact on morale within the American ranks.
He even said that the positive effect was felt by those who hadn't even participated in the fighting, so it really had a ripple effect throughout the army.
And it's important to remember that this Battle of Harlem Heights, this was Washington's first battlefield success of the entire war. I mean, you can only imagine what a boost that must have been for him personally and for his reputation as a commander.
Absolutely. And, after those string of defeats, it was validation that they could stand up to the British and win.
So strategically, it didn't really change the overall course of the campaign in the short term. There was a lull in major fighting for about a month after Harlem Heights, but then, as you mentioned, Washington, he's worried about being trapped on Manhattan, so he moves his army north to White Plains.
Which, unfortunately for the Americans, leads to more defeats at the Battle of White Plains in the fall of Fort Washington.
Right, so ultimately, the retreat continues across New Jersey into Pennsylvania with the British on their heels, so Harlem Heights, it's a bright spot, a morale booster, but it doesn't turn the tide of the war.
But it does provide a crucial psychological lift at a time when the Americans desperately needed it.
And of course, as we touched on earlier, the loss of Colonel Knowlton, that was a major blow to the American intelligence operations. He was a key figure in that aspect of the war.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what the key things we should take away from our look at the Battle of Harlem Heights based on all these sources you've shared?
For me, it really boils down to the fact that while Harlem Heights wasn't a huge strategic victory, it was absolutely crucial for the morale of the Continental Army. It showed them that they could fight the British and win, and that was a huge psychological boost at a time when their confidence was really shaken.
Exactly. And for Washington, it was his first battlefield success, which must have had a profound impact on his leadership and the way his army viewed him.
So for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive into the Battle of Harlem Heights has given you a better understanding of this often overlooked battle and its significance in the grand scheme of the Revolutionary War. We've talked about the tactics, the casualties, and especially that psychological impact.
And it all leads us to a final thought for you to consider. What if the Battle of Harlem Heights hadn't happened? What if the Americans hadn't achieved that victory, however small it might seem? How might the war have unfolded differently, psychologically, for the Continental Army? It's a fascinating question to think about.
Yeah, and it really highlights the importance of even small victories in the face of adversity. Those moments of success can make all the difference in maintaining hope and resilience.
So as you go about your day, we encourage you to reflect on the Battle of Harlem Heights and the lessons it can teach us about leadership, perseverance, and the enduring human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.
And we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for listening.